Welcome to Restaked, brought to you by Sorella Labs. Join us as we explore restaking through conversations with the leading experts in this emerging ecosystem.
GM everyone, welcome back to the Restaking Podcast, where we're diving into everything DeFi and restaking. I'm your host, Abby, and in this episode, we're going to be talking with Ludwig from Sorella, and we're going to be chatting about one of the biggest problems in DeFi, MEV and arbitrage. Our guest over here is Ludwig, co-founder and CEO of Sorella, a company that's raised money from Paradigm. And Ludwig, jumping straight into it, for the listeners who aren't familiar with Sorella, do you want to give us a top down on what Sorella is solving and share a bit more on the team and who Sorella is?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Kind of like high level on what we've been working on for the past 2 years now. So we're focused on fixing AMMs, specifically on Ethereum mainnet at first. And what I mean by fixing AMMs, right now, I'd say like 80 to 85% of the volume that like decentralized exchanges do on Ethereum mainnet and other chains is toxic, and LPs are bleeding money because of it. And the core issue is that they're effectively like selling at these stale prices and getting picked off relatively continuously. So our main focus was to solve that, to make LPing actually profitable, to make DEXs like actually sustainable. And that's like kind of where Angstrom comes in, which is like the protocol / DEX that we're building on top of Uniswap before comes in, and that should come out in less than 2 weeks now.
That's super exciting, and sounds like it's going to be coming out really, really soon. We've been following what you guys have been building and Angstrom for a really long time, so we're super keen. What would you say is the secret sauce behind Sorella? Like the MEV arbitrage is this big problem. There's 850 million that's been lost from LPs due to arbitrage. What is the root cause of the issue, and how is Sorella actually fixing that problem?
I think like where we have, I'd say like somewhat of a competitive edge, and why this problem is like persisted for so long, is that like we came in like after, the OG DeFi founders that created the bulk of the DeFi infrastructure. And we like saw the problem with relatively fresh eyes, and where most of the talent and workers and research in solving MEVs like allocated their resources and time has been at the kind of general protocol layer. And what I mean by protocol layer, I mean like the underlying blockchain. So like Ethereum, and we see this with Flashbots, how they built like MEV Boost. And I use this analogy of like the toilet, the leaking toilet, where instead of like actually fixing the toilet and the leak, you're kind of waterproofing the entire house. And what I mean by this is that they've effectively, and they were right to do this, it was absolutely necessary at the time, they've effectively built a ton of MEV solutions at the protocol level to kind of counteract the negative forces of MEV, so that the protocol at large would remain resilient. But that didn't actually fix the underlying core leakage problem. And so where we're able to solve it is we focus directly on the underlying value leakage at the application layer. And we say, okay, instead of trying to like accommodate for this MEV that we accept as this, this force that will always exist, and this problem that will persist regardless of what we do, how can we redesign the application from the ground up, knowing that like MEV exists and specific actors are extracting value in very precise ways, and instead of accommodating for them, preventing it directly. And so that's kind of the approach that we took with Angstrom. We said, okay, how does an AMM work? What is the core problem? Okay, there are like two major forms of MEV / attacks. There's DEX arbitrage, which is like arbitrage between centralized and decentralized exchanges. And then there is sandwiching. And so how can we design the underlying mechanism design to prevent those two forms of attacks?
Gotcha. Makes sense. And Would you be able to dive a bit deeper into like what the actual mechanism behind Angstrom is? Like these are really big problems, and I think AMMs to me at least are beautiful compared to centralized exchanges because they allow the everyday LP to participate. But while that was, I think all of them wanted to participate at the start. I think we've seen this shift over time where DEXs are either working with professional market makers who are hedging off-chain and doing it properly. So how exactly does Angstrom fix that for LPs? Like, what have you guys implemented? I know you guys are working primarily with UniV4, using their hooks. UniV4 has been hyped up for a long time. It's finally out now. So what exactly are you guys doing with UniV4? Why UniV4, and how are you guys utilizing hooks to solve this problem for LPs?
I think, yeah. So just like breaking down your question, I think I'll like first like kind of outline like how specifically like the arbitrage problem emerges and why LPs are losing money. And then I can kind of go into our actual solution and also touch upon like the remark you made on like DEX is working with professional market makers. So to understand like 6x arbitrage, you need to understand that for a bulk of like the short tail, high volume asset pairs, we're talking like blue chip, ETHUSDT, ETHUSDC, like wrap Bitcoin ETH. The price discovery for these assets happens basically always on Binance. And so you have Binance market makers, providing liquidity for the asset there. Some, event occurs, price discovery ensues, the price will shift on Binance first, basically most of the time. And the problem is that AMMs like aren't actually that smart. Like they operate on a smart contract, but the underlying like mechanism is completely isolated from the outside world. All you have is like reserves of two assets and a mathematical equation that determines like the price of the asset based on the balances. So when there's like this, new event or this information that, is disseminated through the market, and the price changes on Binance, the AMM doesn't react. And it needs arbitrageurs to come and trade against the AMM to rebalance the price, rebalance like the reserves and push the price to the arbitrage price. The problem here is that when you look at it, you actually realize that the liquidity providers in the AMM are effectively trading at the stale / like outdated price compared to the Binance price during that rebalancing event. And that's where they're losing a lot of money. Because arbitrageurs are coming in, they're realizing, okay, the price on Binance is 10, the price on the AMM is 8. Let me, buy on the AMM to bring the price up to 10, and then sell on Binance on centralized exchange at the correct price. And their average execution will be something like 9, and they'll pocket the difference. And the LPs have effectively made a very bad trade. So that's like the core problem, the arbitrage problem for like decentralized exchanges that work as AMMs. What we did to solve this is we said, okay, right now, anyone can trade on this AMM, right? It's completely open. So whoever is first to execute this underlying trade gets to execute the arbitrage. And LPs have no say on, who gets to trade when and at what prices. They just have to accept, any counterparty if it respects like the AMM invariant. So right now the person in control is the chain's proposer, the randomly selected validator that gets to sequence the transactions. And so they get to pick whoever goes first to actually execute the arbitrage. And that, now that we have like this competition that has emerged between arbitrageurs, these arbitrageurs will actually bid for this right. So they'll bribe the proposer, X amount, like X percentage of their profit to be selected as, the person that arbitrages. So if we take that same concept and apply it directly to the AMM and say, okay, not everyone can trade. We're going to have this auction where all of the arbitrageurs can bid for this right to execute the underlying arbitrage, and whoever bids back the most to the liquidity providers gets executed. And so you can imagine it where you have, a ton of market makers that are each competing to offer the best price / the biggest rebate to the LP. And, in a competitive market, 99 / 100% of that value should be bid back to the LPs, where they're no longer paying for these rebalancing actions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So instead of the a percentage of that arbitrage going to the proposer, it's now flowing back to the LPs. And so by doing that, you guys essentially close the gap that the arbitrage created back to the LPs. And it's like, it ends up being essentially like a solver competition for whoever can give as much of that arbitrage back to the LPs as possible.
Yeah, it'd be like, most likely with a competitive, arbitrage market, it would be like 100% of, table stakes, common value bid back to LPs. And what I mean by that is like Binance mid price, which everyone with a baseline level of sophistication can reasonably arbitrage. And after that, you enter a competition where, you have more sophisticated market makers than arbitrageurs that are actually competing based on the alphas that they have. So their ability to like have short-term price predictions. So the bulk of the effective gap that exists today would likely be, rebated 100%, completely eliminating that like rebalance loss.
Makes sense. So essentially like level one is it's at least going to close the gap between the DEX and the Binance mid price. But there's also the possibility that the Binance mid price is not the correct price either. And there's another market maker with alpha that thinks the mid price is going to be something else. And so the LPs may even end up with a bigger amount than to the Binance mid price.
Yeah, so they might push the price like slightly below or slightly higher based on like, their directional signal. But then like the underlying analysis of like that game becomes a bit complicated, because some people, like if this like signal / alpha is like is shared through like across multiple like prop shops or like HFT firms, then realistically that should also be bid back, almost 100% to the LPs. But that wouldn't be real alpha, right? Because it'd be shared across multiple trading firms. There's more so like a scenario of like these different shops having different like price predictions, and then someone winning out but being right, and then you're if the arbitrage auction isn't that competitive, you lose out a little bit, or they're wrong and then they're effectively overpaying in the auction, and then the price has to revert, and LPs are getting that bid in the auction, and on top of that, the bid to revert the mishap in price prediction at the next block or whatever. I think like those like dynamics get a bit complicated and somewhat hard to reason about.
Yeah. And an interesting question I have for you is, what do you think are the key factors that make price discovery happen on, let's say, Binance or centralized exchanges over AMMs? And do you think it'll ever come back to AMMs? Because I think like one of the biggest things is that Ethereum is just so slow compared to decentralized exchanges. But do you think that the ability for AMMs to crowdsource capital will one day enable them to be the actual place for price discovery? Or do you always think it'll happen somewhere else?
I think it will almost always happen on a centralized venue, using like a central limit order book or some, hybrid variation of that, for assets that like people trade massively. AMMs are great for price discovery for very new assets, but they've never really been the like place of price discovery for very heavily traded assets, because there's such a clear disadvantage to trading on like a slow blockchain. So I don't think there's like any price discovery on chain for these big assets today. Do I think that we could compete and they could be traded on like decentralized venues more generally? Yes, but it's going to take like a long while, and we're going to have to create, decentralized exchanges with very close to the level of UX tech, throughput, than like centralized exchanges, basically.
Makes sense. So would you say that the speed of centralized exchange is just the main reason why price discovery happens, or is it like liquidity based? Because like I would argue that if it's liquidity based, then there may be a world where DEXs have more liquidity than centralized exchanges. If LPing becomes profitable, like I think one of the major reasons why DEXs are losing liquidity at the moment is because they either run out of incentives to pay LPs, and then LPs, I mean, half of retail doesn't even know they're losing money. They're just sitting there farming incentives, and they don't really look at IL. So yeah, do you think speed is the main reason?
I think it's not so much speed. It's more like speed plays a role, when we're talking about 12-second block times, let's not be ridiculous here. That's not going to work. But, you have very fast blockchains today. And then being like marginally slower than, like less than an order of magnitude slower than your average like centralized exchange, I don't think will play that big of a role. Because like when we're talking about latency, like it's mostly with respect to other participants that it matters the most. So it's like in this adversarial environment where your counterparty can be an informed trader and you're market making, and you think that you're basically providing liquidity to toxic flow. You want to be able to react very quickly. So like I don't think that the latency thing is the major problem today. I think the biggest problem is the underlying structure and mechanism that all decentralized like blockchains uses to form consensus. What I mean by this is like in a decentralized system where you assume that other nodes could be adversarial, you basically always have this like leader-based consensus and like rotating leader-based consensus. And when you have a leader, like a single leader for a given like time period that gets to decide the ordering of everything on that blockchain, if you don't have like very specific rules in place to prevent, value extraction, they can basically use that monopoly power to extract as much value as possible from, other exchange participants. You kind of see this with HyperLiquid, with like how they have like cancellation priority in like their underlying like transaction sequencing. And I think something like that really helps. But my point basically is you really need to have like specific sequencing rules that take into consideration the underlying like exchange and its design for anyone to be able to provide liquidity effectively and market make effectively on a decentralized exchange. And most like general purpose blockchains could never do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like this is one of the biggest weird things about Ethereum, is that for it to be decentralized the way it is, it's probably going to be slower than everything else out there. And this ends up being, but while doing that, because it's most decentralized, it also is the one with the most liquidity at the moment. So I feel like what you guys are building is super interesting because it gives a way to connect that liquidity to the prices on faster venues.
Yeah. And I think like Ethereum isn't like the only one that suffers from this problem. Like Solana is, significantly faster. But if we look at Solana, you have like this leader / proposer. They get to decide, right? Which transactions get accepted. If there's a limit order on a Solana order book that is stale, and the market maker that provided that limit order wants to cancel it, but the person operating the leader for that round of consensus is an arbitrageur, they can always ensure that their arbitrage happens before the cancellation goes through. Like that underlying dynamic of like having a random third party be the one to select the ordering and not give you explicit priority to prevent like value leakage I think is the core of the issue. And that's something that has to be tackled.
Makes sense. Like, let's just take the life cycle of an Ethereum block. This 12 seconds. How does Angstrom fit into that 12 seconds? Like, what goes on in that 12 seconds to prevent this?
So basically, throughout like the slot, so like the 12 seconds before the actual block is proposed by the leader, we have these Angstrom nodes, which are basically Ethereum nodes that run this like additional sidecar module, and that like they form the Angstrom network, and they're receiving orders and propagating the orders to their peers. So there are two kinds of orders within the system, like high level kinds of orders. There's like the arbitrage orders. So these orders are explicitly trying to execute an arbitrage against the pool and communicate like a bid that they're willing to pay to the LP. And then you have like regular user orders, which are just limit orders. And so as, as the peers kind of broadcast these orders throughout the slot, near the very end of the slot, each leader, each like node, will take the highest paying arbitrage order that it has received and the list of all regular orders that are like valid, and it will sign like this pre-proposal to the rest of the network. And so the then leader of that round will collect all of these signed like pre-proposals and will kind of deduplicate them and select the highest paying arbitrage bid, and will then run a uniform clearing matching algorithm on like the rest of all of the other orders to identify like a single price. So that's like kind of how the batch auction works. It's a component that we haven't really touched upon. And once it's formed that, it basically has this like valid proposal that it will submit to like a builder or the Ethereum mempool to get included and executed against the Angstrom pool on chain. I kind of glossed over a lot of specific details on how the consensus actually operates, because it's probably going to be a bit hard to follow. But the idea here being that at its core, we're trying to identify who's willing to pay the most for the arbitrage, and then we're using that arbitrage to rebalance the pool, and then taking all of the user orders and market maker liquidity and like underlying liquidity from the AMM, combine all of that and provide like a single best price for all of the users within that like block batch. And then we're executing all of that on chain.
How do you guys balance the ultimate price at the end between the, because I feel like the swapper or trader, I mean, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be like an arbitrage or, as you say, like toxic order flow. But then how do you balance it if it's, let's just say, a real user versus the LP?
So they're like they're fully separated by like which orders they're submitting to the system.
Gotcha.
In the sense that they're like kind of two ways that you can trade on Angstrom. The first way is like as an arbitrager. And so this is when you explicitly want to trade directly against the liquidity pool and be the first and only person to do that within the block. And you get a 0% trading fee when doing this, under the assumption, of course, that like as you're bidding in the auction, that fee is just like incorporated within the auction bid, if you will. After the pool has been rebalanced by this arbitrager, you have everyone else. So market makers and, like retail order flow, or like people that just want, fair price. They don't want to get sandwiched. They want low fees and they want to access the liquidity. Here, they're not specifying that they want to be, the first one to execute against the pool, because if they're not winning the, arbitrage auction, they won't be, and they know this. And what happens there is like, once the pool has been rebalanced, so the arbitragers executed the swap against the pool, which now should reflect, the fair market value of the asset. We can incorporate that, AMM liquidity and all of the off-chain, user order and market maker limit order liquidity, and identify a single price at which the like supply and demand curves intersect. So that's like basically a fancy way of saying like where the bids and asks intersect. And through that, we can identify a single price at which we can clear all this volume and then execute it on chain. So it isn't so much like a balancing act of discriminating with some fancy and smart rule, but more so like a product of the underlying mechanism. The incentives for arbitrageurs are very much to bid in the arbitrage batch, and the incentives of regular users is very much not to do that because they won't win or gain anything.
Gotcha. Makes sense. So the first thing that happens is the arbitrager bids, and that'll move the current pool price to whatever the arbitrager said. Let's just say the Binance bid price, and then everyone else that is part of that block then executes at the same price from that mid price.
Not like necessarily the same price, but often
not the same, but from there.
And basically, like they're pulling the liquidity post arbitrage. So they're accessing, like if we can match you peer to peer directly. So I'm a market maker, you're a retail order. You've sent, like an limit order with limit price at Binance Mid, and I'm willing to match you at that price. And we're the only two orders in the batch, and we have like same amounts. We'll get matched directly. If I'm willing to match 50% of your order, and then the remainder 50% has to come from the liquidity pool, we like both of those will be your liquidity sources, if that makes sense. And that you can kind of extrapolate that to everyone within the batch. The one notable thing is that they're all getting the same price. So it isn't like order dependent. And that's kind of how you prevent the sandwich problem, is that there's no benefit for you to come first as opposed to last within the batch, because regardless, you'll get the same price.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then how do you guys distribute the bid from the arbitrager to the pool?
We take it all for the protocol.
Meaning?
I don't know. I'm just kidding. I wish.
Okay. I wish.
I wish we just take that.
This is going so good.
No. I wish. So we don't actually take a fee on that because that would make LPs negative in expectation. What we do instead is we distribute it pro rata to the liquidity that is utilized within the swap. So this is like a fancier way of basically saying, when you're swapping through specific ticks or like a single tick. There's like liquidity at those ticks, and the bid is like being compensated for those specific ticks in the exact like pro rata amount of how much is like used. So the math basically ends up being like who has contributed like in terms of liquidity providers as a whole, because they're non-fungible, because concentrated liquidity position changes things. You have to figure out specifically which ticks to give to based on what liquidity the swap used.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know you said that you guys are only deploying onto Ethereum mainnet initially, but I'm curious as to how you see this solution extending to faster chains. Like, I know there's been a lot of hype around chains like Mega ETH, also like Unichain came out with flash blocks as well. I'm curious as to whether you think it'll be as useful on these chains or more useful, or how does it sit in relation to like chain speed?
I think it's like less useful if we maintain the current design, insofar as our design here was very specific to Ethereum mainnet, and we made it to be as gas efficient as possible. We made it to be, to work within like Ethereum block times, etc. We could crank things up, and just like match very easily Unichain speed. It's not so much a problem of like the underlying infrastructure of Angstrom being performant enough. It's more about like us wanting to change the design to improve it based on like the specific market microstructure of different chains. Will it be like as useful in terms of like global lever recaptured and like arbitrage prevented? Probably not, just because 12 seconds is just such a long time for prices to diverge. And that's kind of why we're launching on Ethereum at the beginning. It's because that's where the problem is by far the largest. But, let us not like interpret that as like an indication that things are going well on these other chains either. They're still getting picked off. AMMs are still performing very poorly on these faster chains. It's just like less observable, but they need like a significant overhaul. I think with like these faster and cheaper chains, it just opens the design space of like what's possible and how we can implement similar solutions. And so we think we can like provide like way cooler solutions because we actually have the freedom of doing like some amount of compute on chain. One other thing that we're really excited about is like this idea of using like team builders. So within like the sequencer, because that kind of gives you like superpowers in terms of like all of the compute that you can do, how fast your underlying system can be, etc.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And like maybe switching to like the other side of the spectrum, because I think one of the most successful but like weirdly successful versions of like users providing liquidity right now is HyperLiquid with HLP, which has essentially been like the only place where users have been able to provide liquidity where they haven't lost money. At least if they stuck in there long enough, they haven't lost money. There's been drawdowns and stuff from different events, but in general, people have made money in HLP. Do you have any opinions on HLP and the structure of that? Because essentially that's letting the HyperLiquid team provide all of the liquidity for you, which can be seen as good and also bad, very bad. And I feel like it's the complete opposite to Uniswap and their sort of approach to it.
Yeah, like people saying that it's bad because it's like closed sourced and isn't like giving users insight on how the liquidity is managed, like don't, I think, understand that it would only be possible as a closed source thing. So I don't blame them for it being like it literally would not be feasible because you'd effectively be leaking your strategy to everyone, which implies that like everyone would front run you or manipulate manipulate your strategy to extract as much value as possible. So they don't really have a choice. Like what I think about it, I think like it's a great product. We've seen it throughout time, like it works really well. We've actually kind of thought about releasing something similar and are likely going to release something similar for Angstrom like later down the line. But the important thing to remember is like this isn't really a product; it's marketing. It's a marketing tool. Like the ability to build something like HLP is basically it basically means the team knows how to like successfully market make on exchanges, right? And so if they can successfully market make on exchanges, they can do that themselves with very low risk and produce like very high returns. So they don't really need anyone else's capital. And they're effectively like taking a P&L hit, most likely because to accept like that much capital, they probably have to alter their strategy because you have capacity constraints to some extent. So that they could accept all of these user deposits to generate yield for them, so that people, are happy to use HyperLiquid. And I think what Jeff understood very early is like the best marketing is to make your users rich. And that's kind of what he did with HLP. But it doesn't make sense outside of that lens. If that makes sense to you. Basically what I'm saying is like no one else would do this except for marketing, because to be able to do what he's doing with HLP implies that he can do it on his own. And if he can do it on his own, he can very easily source capital and be extremely profitable.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. When you said you guys are going to do it something similar for Angstrom, like essentially HLP but for spot markets, okay, that's super interesting. Cool. Leading on from HyperLiquid, how do you feel about on-chain clubs versus AMMs? Do you guys see yourself as only working with AMMs, or is there an angle for Angstrom to do stuff with clubs?
I think like we're already not I'd argue like just an AMM. I think we exist within like this sort of hybrid like club / AMM that does like frequent batch auctions. So we're trying to get like the best of both worlds in that sense. But yeah, I definitely don't see ourselves like working exclusively with AMMs. I think on-chain clubs can work really well, but they require specific rules at the sequencing layer that prevent, like baseline arbitrage that would exist if left unchecked. So within like the right environment, I think they're great, but it is unlikely to that environment's unlikely to emerge within like general purpose chains, and will basically only emerge on like app specific chains, as you kind of see with HyperLiquid. But if a general purpose chain does create that sort of functionality, I'd love to work on that for sure.
Yeah, because like Solana has a few on-chain clubs like Phoenix, and I think Mega ETH is going to have one as their main DEX as well. But yeah, I 100% agree. Like the special sequencing rules of HyperLiquid as an app chain is probably the biggest advantage it has right now. It's something that we've been looking at quite closely, like within the HyperLiquid space, is like, with the Hyper EVM, how's this going to interact with Hypercore? And I think it's one of the things that we're super bullish on to HyperLiquid, is that they've essentially enshrined liquidity into the ecosystem, and this means that the Hyper, like the EVM environment, can focus on things that leverage the liquidity rather than trying to do it itself.
Yeah, but I think a very important thing to remember is like this, like the whole like the app specific sequencing on a HyperLiquid works right now because it's just them running like the validators. And so this is like a question that I asked Jeff and didn't get a reply, unfortunately. But when you look at the like underlying like consensus mechanism, the cancellations, like order cancellations, have to be prioritized, but nothing is stopping a validator from censoring them, right? So like within those dynamics, I think a lot of problems will emerge for a HyperLiquid where they realize that like with progressive decentralization, you need to take into account adversarial behavior, which then, adds like complexity, which is very much solvable complexity. You can have like a censorship resistant consensus mechanism like the one that we have, but that adds, a round of network propagation, like around consensus and like additional network propagation, and adds like latency to that. But I don't think we're operating at like the very limit of how like performant things can be anyway. So I don't imagine it being, like a forever problem. It's just going to be a bit harder.
That makes a ton of sense. And like maybe looking out longer term for Angstrom, for Sorella, how do you guys see the next 3 to 5 years panning out? Now, you guys are going to be launching in 2 weeks. So let's just say 3 years plus 2 weeks. Where do you guys see the ecosystem being, with you guys finally there as the first real solution to this big problem that's been impacting the space pretty much since inception?
My hope is that, like over the next year, we're able to dominate like spot volume on Ethereum. We're hopefully able to attract, very significant liquidity into our pools, have a very, competitive arbitrage auction and recapture really like the bulk of the value, see, sandwiching go down significantly, and then release, pseudo products for LPs to opt into to just improve their P&L. So like HLP style kind of vaults that maybe operate like slightly differently, that just give LPs like an additional yield boost. That's like, short term, like very concrete, grounded goals of like, okay, let's dominate on Ethereum spot. Let's fix the problem let's recapture this value and let's stop this, immense leakage. Longer term though, I think like with a success on mainnet, we can move to these other chains, customize our underlying solution for their specific market dynamics, and then hopefully like join all of these solutions long term. So you have like this unified kind of liquidity layer across these multiple chains, where you have, these batch auctions that are operating, that are completely chain abstracted, that offer the same MEV protections, and then enable you to do like seamless trading wherever you are for any destination, with liquidity sourced across like the entire spectrum of market makers and liquidity providers across all of these chains. But that's definitely going to take quite a bit of work.
Makes sense. And like maybe to wrap it up, beyond Angstrom as a solution, you guys have built, I think, insane tooling. I think if people haven't checked out your website, they should go and they should have a look at, the MEV Explorer, because it's just crazy to have a look at things happening in real time. But beyond Angstrom, do you guys see yourself building out anything else? And if you could, like, what's next to solve? Because like, at least from like my perspective, you guys are solving the arbitrage problem, but I think there's also other problems impacting LPs. Potentially this HLP solution that you're talking about for spot is a solution, but like there's also just unsophisticated LPs who just LP on chain. They use like a Uni V4 position and they set it too narrow, and then they wake up the next day and they're completely out of range. Then it's like, even though there was no arbitrage, they've just lost money because they put their liquidity in the wrong place. Do you guys see yourself moving on to that as like potentially the next problem to solve once arbitrage is solved?
Yeah, definitely. I think like creating very performance strategies, and this is kind of like what I meant by the HOT thing, which both, provide liquidity directly in like the Angstrom order book, and at the same time have, liquidity in the AMM and are dynamically, shifting that liquidity, is probably like the second biggest component after solving the underlying arbitrage issue. Because now that LPs can actually be profitable, they still need to have, performance strategies. Let us not like be under the impression that they can just, YOLO ambient range and have like a great payoff. They'll have like a rebalancing portfolio of like the two assets, which is not a bad thing to hold. But if they want, like high returns, they're definitely going to have to be a bit more sophisticated. So making that accessible to anyone would be, definitely like the second biggest milestone we're looking for, because you could just make the entire DeFi market so much more capital efficient. Like right now we have these liquidity pools with hundreds of millions of TVL that are doing very low volume numbers, and it's just wasteful. Like this money does not need to be parked here. It creates, higher costs for teams and for like various projects to spin up their own liquidity. But if it was managed more effectively, they could get so much more out of it. So that's like something we're really excited to focus on.
Yeah, that sounds super exciting. And as a final question, if there was something that you could change about the space, or something that you want to see be done in the space, let's say over the next year, what would it be and why?
I think this is like a bit of a technical one, but so this is something that's like I discussed with Max Resnick like 8 to 10 months ago, and like recently chatted with like one of the Solana like engineers a few weeks ago, is this idea of creating like app specific rules that control like sequencing of the protocol's transactions, where you basically give the right to Uniswap or to any other app, decide the order of how like transactions will be sequenced and executed. And so like for less technical listeners or anyone else, this probably sounds like the most boring, like useless thing ever. But if you actually get that as a functionality as an app developer, you can kind of streamline the entire process. You can basically bring MEV down to zero because you get to have like any arbitrarily complex logic that figures out, okay, who gets to do this action and in what order. So you can prevent like a ton of stuff out of the box. You can create like all sorts of complex auctions very simply, and it can all happen like on chain without the complexity of like this additional off-chain network. Like a lot of the complexity within Angstrom, for example, comes from the fact that like none of this functionality exists and will likely ever exist on Ethereum. But if it did, it would make things so much easier. So for high value apps like ours, like it is worth the additional complexity and technical challenge to actually push through and make this system efficient because hundreds of millions, if not billions, are being lost. But for smaller apps or like less popular use cases that still want to optimize, then it makes less sense today because the barriers to entry to doing this are pretty high. So if we could allow them to do it, I think we'd have like a ton of creativity come out of it and so much cool, DeFi like 3.0 kind of innovation that benefits from it.
What's an example outside of Angstrom that if this exists, do you think would be the coolest to see?
I think liquidation, like a very concrete example would be like on-chain liquidations. So you want to liquidate someone's position. Right now, like the lending protocols just will liquidate you basically directly. You can have this like very simple on-chain auction where whoever pays the highest priority fee, like goes first, if you will. And they, most of the priority fee, instead of going to like the builder or sequencer or whatever, is actually like sent back to the person getting liquidated. This is like the priority is all you need kind of auction example that like Dan Robertson and Dave White wrote about. I think that's like probably the simplest example I can think of. But as things get more complicated, like you want control of not just like one transaction, but multiple ideally. And then like how they interleave and coexist becomes really useful.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I can imagine it being super useful because right now you're essentially competing to have things in its own order and having these sort of siloed, I guess, auctions at the end of the day, or maybe not auctions as well, is super useful to not have to compete with the rest of the blockchain.
I guess like another like very simple example that wouldn't work in like a priority is all you need scenario is cancellations. Say you have an order book, you want cancellations to go through first, right? You want to prioritize them. On Solana, there's no way you can do that, right? Like the highest paying one will go first, or if they're not using like Jito, like the first one that the like validator receives. Here, what you could do is, as the app, you could like collect the list of transactions within the block, right? And then you would filter out all the cancellations and basically sequence/execute them first. And then all of the remainder orders would execute after. So you could guarantee that like for a given block, if your cancellation happens at the same time as like someone's trying to arbitrage your order within that block, cancellation goes through first.
Which would solve what we were talking about earlier with essentially clubs not working on chain. That's super dope. Well, cool, man. Well, I really appreciate you coming on to the podcast, and it was super enjoyable to talk about Angstrom, and yeah, really looking forward to it launching in 2 weeks. For the listeners, where can they find out more about Angstrom? Where can they find you guys? And
so for socials, so the Angstrom Twitter is Angstrom XYZ. So ANGSTROM XYZ. And then my personal Twitter is 0x Van Beethoven. So like the composer. So yeah, most of the info should be published on like one of those two accounts. We're going to be releasing like the docs in our white paper quite soon, which should provide like a more like complete and detailed rundown on how it works. Because I know it's it's not the simplest system, so it's a bit tricky to follow explanations in like a podcast format.
Awesome. We're looking forward to them. We'll make sure to pop all of that in the description. But yeah, thanks again for jumping on, and yeah, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This was great.
All right. Catch you.
Yeah.
Restaked is brought to you by Swell Labs. To find out more about Swell, go to swellnetwork.io and make sure to search for Restaked wherever you listen to podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. Make sure to hit the follow button so you don't miss any future episodes. Thanks for listening.